Hey, you guys, Kristen here, and welcome to Poolside PD for 2026. If you've been around, you know this is my favorite time of the year where I'm coming at you with bite-sized, actionable items twice a week based on everything I've kind of reflected on and grown with over the year. So this year's Poolside PD is going to be no different. You'll hear from me 2 times a week, June, July, and August. June, we're doing some deep reflections on what I've actually learned about myself as a teacher and like the teaching process as I've started on my national board certification journey. So I'm really excited to start sharing that with you today. July, we're going to be doing a book study. You guys really enjoyed Productive Struggle. So stay tuned. Next week, I will share what our book study is so that you can all get a hold of it. And I promise you, it's a great read or listen if you are sitting poolside with your favorite beverage of choice. And then in August, we were talking all about actionable items that are going to make sure that you're like ready to go in the classroom and ready to hit the ground running whenever it is that you have to do that. So if you're up for it, I'm so ready to do this. You guys, today I'm going to talk to you about how I used to wing it. Honestly, and I thought that I could, and I did. I could and I did. And, obviously I did not completely wing it. I still lesson planned. I had my calendar. I knew my activities. I knew where we were going with everything. Because I know my students and I love them and I wanted to make sure that they were learning what it was, but I had taught the content so many times already that I thought, oh, I know where this lesson is going. I know what the students need to do. I know where they get kind of caught up. I know how to explain this. And a lot of the time, it was enough. I'm not going to lie. But this year changed that for me. So between piloting a brand new curriculum and teaching both co-taught and traditional Algebra 2 classes and beginning the process of national board certification, I stopped thinking about teaching as how do I get through this lesson and really started thinking more about what experience are my students actually going to have during this lesson? Okay, so not how do I get through it, but what experience are my students going to have? And honestly, you guys, that shift changed everything. So in our first kickoff episode of Poolside PD, today we're going to talk about why this was the year that I stopped winging it, what becoming more intentional actually looked like in my classroom, and why I think intentional teaching, not perfect teaching, is truly what moves our learning forward. So let's start with one of the biggest realizations that I had this year. Knowing math is not the same thing as designing a quality math experience. And that sounds obvious when I say it out loud, right? But it's not something that I think everyone fully understands because, I've taught a lot of math over the years. I've taught Algebra 1, Geometry, Algebra 2, Personal Finance, Intervention courses, and I've always had a really strong understanding of where my students are coming from and where they're going because of that diverse experience. I knew how those concepts built over time, and I think that gave me a lot of confidence. In fact, I'm sure it did, right? But confidence can sometimes trick you into thinking, well, then the good teaching will just naturally happen, right? And this year, with piloting and with being on my board journey, I realized that there's so much more to it than that. Good teaching is really intentionally designed, right? So this year, as I mentioned, we piloted the illustrative math curriculum. And let me tell you guys, the learning curve, because the curriculum is deeply inquiry-based, which, guys, it's like chef's kiss. If you're into that, it's a fantastic program for you. It connects to the real world. It hits a lot of the real relevant, rigorous aspects that I'm going for, right? And my students, though, they have never learned through an entirely inquiry-based model before. And I hadn't taught through an entirely inquiry-based model before. I'd always done project-based learning. I've always had inquiry units mixed in there. But I also recognize some things are very procedural skills and they don't need a project, right? So this was our first year going all in one methodology. And I really quickly realized something important. I could not just follow the lesson as it was written and expect it to magically work for my students. Don't get me wrong. They give you a ton of great materials, and you can even access their curriculum online for free, right? But the curriculum was good. It was solid, right? But I needed to remember that teaching is responsive, not prescriptive. Especially when your students are unfamiliar with their structure, you're considering all the different personalities of your classes, and you're teaching different settings like co-taught and traditional classes. So I became so much more intentional about making sure all 4 of my Algebra 2 preps were designed in a way that met the needs of the students in that classrooms. It wasn't just what am I teaching? It was how are my students experiencing this lesson and what can I do to best support them in it? And I started thinking, this is probably the biggest shift of all, okay? I wasn't just thinking about planning around what I was going to do as the teacher. I started planning around what my students needed to experience, what they needed to gain from that experience. And that changed my basically everything, right? My pacing, my transitions, my questioning, my grouping, what routines I used. Every little thing became a little bit more intentional. So things like trying to build in mini brain breaks or turn in talks. If I knew that I could just sense my class was at a moment that they were needing to digest this a little bit more. Using exit tickets halfway through class to reset attention. That was a really good game changer that we employed a couple of times this year that really helped with the material. Making my students, like I said, turn and talk before we do a group share out to give them that little bit of confidence. Random grouping more often. I didn't get to it as much this year, but I have plans for when to use it more for next year. Again, being intentional. And getting back into using my whiteboards consistently. So that's something I'm still aspiring to do intentionally in my classroom. And I use this year in my pilot year to see where those things, those other best practices I love, are going to come into play. Right? None of these are going to be random decisions. They become instructional design choices. And honestly, you guys, that made teaching feel more intellectual again. Like it wasn't just, hey, I know algebra 2. I can teach you function transformations. Here we go. Left, right, up, down. Let's do this. Let's, whatever it was. Not that was bad and my kids still learned, but everything was more intentional, more thoughtfully designed. I was really enjoying prepping for my classes again. Okay. And I also completely changed this year how I think about differentiation. That's one of the components that I was working on this year. And, for years, I thought differentiation meant either different assignments or different levels, giving students options. And it sometimes can mean those things, right? But this year, it became something deeper. It was, how can I differentiate class to class? And honestly, you probably should, because every class period has a different personality. They have different pacing needs. They have different dynamics, different confidence levels. And trying to force every class to look identical doesn't actually serve my students. It didn't. I wasn't going to teach the same lesson to my 7th hour that I taught to my 2nd hour that I taught to my 4th hour or to my 6th hour, right? Some classes needed more structure. Some needed more discussion. Some needed more movement. Some needed more processing time. Others were ready to move faster or work more independently. And I loved the are you ready for more for that? My students who were ready had something to work on while we were all getting there, right? And once I gave myself that permission this year to respond to the actual humans in front of me, that actual class of students, my teaching got better. And honestly, it made teaching a lot more fun for me because every hour then became its own experience instead of the same humdrum doing the same thing over and over again, repeating myself 5 times. Now, that's not to say that by the last time I taught a lesson, I wasn't done with that lesson, because I was, right? But I knew that class and I knew how to tailor it to their needs. It was also the last class of the day, the last class of the week. If you're talking about trying to get your 16 and 17-year-old students to lock in with you Friday from 1 to 2:30, that is a way different experience than trying to get a group of students to lock in with you from 7:30 to 9 in the morning, okay? Right? It just is, okay? So differentiating class to class, huge for me this year. Now, another thing that I kept thinking about this year is rigor, right? Because I want my classroom to be rigorous. It's one of my 3 R's, one of the things I believe in the most. I want my students thinking deeply. I want them struggling productively. I want them making sense of the mathematics. But I also realized that struggle is part of that learning and that too much struggle is drowning. Really super kudos to all of you for doing the productive struggle with me. My entire, not even just my district, my county. We all did a book study on it together, right? Like this was a thing for us, right? And I realized that distinction between the productive and the drowning, that distinction matters. So I really started thinking more intentionally about what are the supports, the structure, the pacing, and the feedback loops that I needed to implement in my classroom. So things like using our checkpoint quizzes, things about supporting our students with these learning target sheets that kind of evolved over time, right? Considering different types of reflection with my students and having forms. The discussion routines that illustrative mathematics builds in, they're fantastic, right? And then thinking about some more structures from the productive struggle, something like a 3 before me. Like, how can I make this work better in this system, right? They're not just management tools, right? They are the supports and scaffolds for rigorous thinking and learning. And I think sometimes we act like rigor and support are opposites, but they're not. The best classrooms are rigorous classrooms with structures of support so that students can have both. Now, the most surprising part this year was really just how much I learned. Right? There were so many concepts that I learned this year that I finally understand so much deeper as a teacher. Things that, honest to God, I straight up just memorized as a student and used to like briefly refresh myself on as a teacher before I taught it, right? So things that I know better this year than I ever had before. Transformations of functions. Absolutely. Inverse relationships. Sequences. The evolution of the number system and like why complex numbers even exist in the first place, right? Suddenly, I wasn't just teaching these procedures anymore. I wasn't just teaching these are the rules and this is what you do, or like logarithms as exponents and what they actually mean, right? I started teaching more of the story of mathematics, right? Like realizing that every expansion of the number system happens because mathematicians encountered a problem that they couldn't solve with the numbers they had. Like, sure, we have 5 cows, and now what do we say if we have no cows? Let's make that a number. Let's make that 0. What do we say if I owe a debt to someone? Let's invent these negative numbers. Let's learn this is now the integer system. What if I'm dividing something into pieces? Now we've got the rational system, right? It was fascinating and mind-blowing to me. And it made me realize how intellectually rich mathematics actually is. It is not just rules and procedures. It is so fascinating, so deeply like thought-provoking, and I just loved it. So love that I got that out of this year for me. So really, to wrap it up, so far this year has taught me that teaching math is really deeply intellectual work when it's done right. And it's not because we need to know all the answers. It is because, though, we are constantly analyzing and adjusting, designing, reflecting, responding. And really, I think I became more intentional. That made me a better teacher this year. Not a perfect teacher, but definitely a more thoughtful one and a more reflective one. I'd heard it said that the National Board Certification process is a process for growing yourself and your skills. And it definitely has been that for me. So I'm not perfect, right? I'm real. I am not perfect. If you're watching me on YouTube, this is one of my things. But I am more thoughtful. I am more reflective, and I am really excited to dive into some of the best lessons that I learned this year. So I think that matters, and I'm really excited for Poolside PD for this. So listen, guys, if this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. What has changed in your teaching this year? And if you're trying to think about becoming more intentional about when to use projects, performance tasks, or practice in your classroom, I've got the free guide to help you out with that. Until next time, you guys, it's Poolside PD. That sun is calling my name. I'm going to go catch some rays. Maybe I'll have a tan next time you see me. And until next time, keep it real.